Good morning. I want to start with thanking all of you for the outpouring of love that I received last week as we started to say farewell of the process of the next few weeks as I head home to California. As I said last week, this year has been incredibly transformative for me, and I hope that I have been able to give back half of what I received from this church. One of the longest and oldest relationships in my life is with my friend Aaliyah. We have known each other since third grade and stayed friends through the years. And I've learned a lot from this relationship. I have often, over the course of our friendship, tried to come up with ways to keep the relationship exciting and fresh. Always try to think of things to do, of ways to help. But one of the most important lessons that I've learned from that relationship is the power of being present with someone who loves you. In high school, Aaliyah got me very interested in the love languages, and that there are these 5 different ways generally that people show love. And Aaliyah shows love through quality time. And that's always been something that's hard for me. I want to be doing things, I want to be exploring, I want depth and newness. But in my relationship with Aaliyah, I have learned that that always has to start with presence. That only happens through intimacy when you spend time with someone. In this story from John, we see Mary, who is alone at the tomb. The disciples have gone home. They have looked for a new way of living, separate from God, separate from Jesus, thinking that Jesus was dead. But Mary stays. Mary stays in the presence of Jesus even after she thinks he's gone. At the tomb, they have a conversation that presents a new way of living, that sets the tone for the relationship that we have with God. But before we get there, I want to look at another conversation that happens with God that sets the tone for a relationship between God and humanity. In Genesis 3, right after the fall, Adam and Eve are hiding in the garden. They hear God walking through the garden, and instead of accepting God's presence, they hide. They run. They have just done the one thing that they know they weren't supposed to do. They know that they have sinned. They know that they have fallen. And their shame makes them hide from God. Of course, they can't do that for long, and God finds them. And we see a relationship of estrangement, of distance, that results from this shame, from this hiding. Our shame separates us from God. But Mary, who is also well aware of her sin and of her brokenness, Mary stays. And not only that, when she sees Jesus, she runs to him. She clings to him. Mary knows that intimacy with God is not a result of transformation. It is the cause of transformation. We see in this moment that this is a turning point for humanity, that whatever has happened with the crucifixion and resurrection, whatever mystical experience and transformation has taken place, there is now the old creation and the new creation. We are living in a new world. Up until this point, Jesus has exclusively referred to God the Father as my Father. He points to my Father in heaven. But here, we see that Jesus says he is returning to my Father and your Father. We see that this new creation is one of intimacy and closeness, not shame and estrangement. The reason Mary runs to Jesus is because he says her name. Originally, she doesn't even know who he is. She thinks he's the gardener. She is caught up in her grief and in her loneliness that she can't even see Jesus beside her. But when he says her name, when he establishes that connection and calls on the relationship that they already have, she knows that this is a new moment. She knows that this relationship with God starts with being known and by knowing God. This relationship is open to all of us, but we have to accept it. One of my favorite poets, Morgan Nicola Wren, often writes about her complex relationship with God. In particular, in her poetry book, Communion Wine in a Shot Glass, she talks about how her relationship with God does not fit the clean-cut, pristine template she was shown as a child. In her poem, The Book of Salvation Complex, she talks about her fear of intimacy with God. She says, "Knowing you exist was never the problem. In fact, it's this very faith that lights hellfire up my dreams almost every night. It's believing you love me that's asking for a miracle. You cannot tell me enough that I am safe, or maybe you've said it too many times. Maybe this whole house I've made of my body is painted the color of your mercy until it all looks the same to me, till I can't recognize myself as something worth dying for anymore. So, until I can kill this self-loathing inside of me and feel your salvation flowing through me like a newly loosed spirit, I will just have to trust you to love me for all the conviction that I have yet to nail to my tongue." From the beginning to the end of this poem, we see a transformation. We see the poet moving from the old creation into the new creation. But this movement to new creation is not the result of getting it right. It's not the result of dispelling all doubt. It's not even the result of understanding God's mercy. This transformation and this shift to new creation is chosen through trusting in God, even in the doubt, even in the brokenness. Only in that trust can we even begin to start healing our brokenness. The trust and the intimacy is the starting point, not the prize for completing the task. We see at the beginning that the poet does not reject God. Just like Adam and Eve in the garden, they know that God exists, they know who God is, and it is this very thing that makes them afraid. Adam and Eve hide because they are afraid of what God might do. But Mary runs to God knowing what he has done, knowing what God is doing in the world. She trusts in that intimacy as a starting point for her transformation and accepts it as an outpouring of God's love. This intimacy, this relationship, is of course a two-way street. After Jesus names Mary, she also names him. She names him teacher. That this relationship that she has already established, that is born out of the intimacy that they already have. Our relationship with God goes both ways, and God accepts the names we give to him. We get to name God based off of our relationship with him and what he has already done in our lives. Just as Mary calls Jesus teacher, she accepts that role in her life, asking him to continue it. The continued role, though, is fundamentally changed. It allows for and is made possible by the newfound intimacy that we have with the Creator. That this is not the estrangement and the fear and the shame that humanity has known. This is something new. God has wiped the slate clean and is calling us forward. Just as Mary names Jesus teacher, he also sends her out. After she runs to him, Jesus tells her not to cling to him, that he's not yet ascended to the Father. Jesus accepts the role that he is given and in turn sends her out to be a teacher. He sends her out to be the apostle to the apostles. Mary is still a disciple, but her relationship with God informs and shapes her relationship with her neighbors. What she has learned from Jesus, she brings with her out into the world. The past several weeks in the teen class on Wednesday nights, we've been talking about spiritual pathways, this idea that there are several different ways that we can love God and worship God. It will probably not come as a shock to many of you that I am an activist, that I relate to God through going and doing, through changing. And it might not come as a surprise to you that my lowest scoring pathway was contemplative. I've never felt comfortable sitting in a quiet room alone with God and praying. I've always asked for something to do, wanted action, wanted movement. And yet, we see in this moment that Mary's action starts from presence. It starts from that connection with God. The intimacy with God transforms our relationship and allows for intimacy with all of creation. I'll admit that for most of my life, I looked down on contemplatives. I thought that we as Christians were called to be hands and feet, to go out, to change the world, to bring about the kingdom. And we are. But my mistake was thinking that an activist and a contemplative are opposites. That we are called to do, not to be with God. And in fact, what I have learned is that we cannot do without being with God. That activists and contemplative mindsets rely on one another. We cannot do without being, and we cannot be without doing. This relationship with God calls us forward, that this intimacy with God gives us tasks to go forward and to participate with God in the creation and the spreading of this new kingdom. Maybe you want to participate in this kingdom through evangelizing, through speaking to people in your life who might not know the gospel. Maybe you want to work with Debbie on the Meals for the Pacific House shelter and serve those who can't serve themselves. Maybe you want to confront systems of injustice in the world around us. Whatever it may be, what is your relationship with God calling you forward to do? This week, consider how you might face God this week, acknowledging your need for transformation and asking Him to rid you of the shame that causes estrangement. And once you've done that, ask God what He might be sending you out to do.